Hi, Graham. How are you? Farshid's going to say one.
Thank you, Judy. Lovely to see you. Thank you for that.
Lovely to see you got everyone too. Hi, Verna. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Judy.
How are you?
Hello, Judy.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, June. Wow, all these people I haven't seen for so long.
Yeah.
Wow.
Lovely.
Thank you, friends. I'm going to mute all now. Except if I can, maybe you can. I'm going to mute all.
Just unmute us.
And then need to unmute.
Allah Hafiz.
O God, refresh and gladden my spirit. Purify my heart. Illumine my powers. I lay all my affairs in thy hand. Thou art my guide and my refuge. I will no longer be sorrowful and grieved. I will be a happy and joyful being. O God, I will no longer be full of anxiety, nor will I let trouble harass me. I will not dwell on the unpleasant things of life. O God, thou art more friend to me than I am to myself. I dedicate myself to thee, O Lord.
Well, thank you so much for that, and welcome all to this presentation. In this centenary year for the Australian Bahai community, one idea was to explore the depth of our history and biography, and by coming together in attempting to do that. Now, the idea of this series is not to make refined presentations, but look at works in progress and to learn, to see what we still need to learn about this community. We have a first series. We started last week with Michael Van Beck, who gave a wonderful presentation on Effie Baker. Tonight I'm giving a bit of an overview of the Australian Bahai community, but I'm doing that as a way of framing the sessions that are going to follow. And as you see, we have next week Erin Blomley. The week after, I will speak about Collis Featherson, and June Perkins then will speak about Fred Murray. Then we go into some wonderful sessions that show us how to develop archives, the role of archives, and other tools for genealogy, and then other tools for using Trove, which is a wonderful resource for history in general in Australia. So welcome to this online series. That's the first set that will go through June and July. Now, there may be some online who are not aware of the Baha'i teachings and the Baha'i history in general. And I'm going to just spend 1 or 2 minutes speaking about that before I move into the history of the community. The central figures of the Baha'i faith, the Bab, Baha'u'llah, the Prophet, his son Abdul Baha, and Abdul Baha's grandson Shoghi Effendi, are known as central figures. This session tonight is not looking at the central figures, but they do play an important role in the history of the Australian community and will be referred to as we go through. I'm sorry, my wonderful presentation isn't coming through in the right order sometimes. So there's a second series that is going to follow the first. And in this series, the idea is to spend one of these sessions looking at each of the Australian states and to find a number of people who have been working behind the scenes on collecting the history of those states. And we've identified a number already. who have volunteered to come, to show us what they've been doing in those areas. And over the next couple of weeks, I'll find a few more volunteers. And of course, if there are no volunteers, we still do know a little bit about the histories of those states, and we will continue with those sessions. So please, if you're interested in that, please let me know. Now, I started to talk about this slide with the central figures, and hopefully the next part of the slide comes down. The fundamental principles of our faith, in brief, that there is just the one by whatever name, God in English, other terms, Yahweh and Allah, but whatever name, one creator. And I think one of the central features of the Baha'i teachings is that of continuity of religion, the idea of progressive revelation, that the Christian revelation, the Islamic, the Buddhist, Jewish, Baha'i, and other religions come in a progression through history. It's crucial to understanding the mentality of the Australian Baha'i community. And I think so importantly at this current time in the evolution of global society is the idea that we're one human family, and the implications of that, of our racial equality, our gender equality, as we find a way forward as a single harmonious global society. I think another fundamental principle is the emphasis on cultivation of spiritual qualities at the individual level and up through national communities, up to the world society as a whole. I think also very important to the Baha'i worldview is the harmony of science and religion, because it brings together our powers of reason and the use of the intellect, matching up with the need for values and virtues in this modern world. The progressive social teachings, which I mentioned just in brief, and I mention this because there are some people who are in this presentation who are not so familiar with all of the Baha'i teachings, but race equality, gender equality, but also deliberative decision-making as a progressive social teaching that takes us away from the type of conflict that we see in our discourse. The global roadmap for peace building, that is part of the Baha'i approach to solving the world's problems, and that comes with a global roadmap for social and economic development as well. There are some wonderful websites. I've mentioned a couple at the top of that screen, and also the website of the Baha'i International Community, which goes into extensive detail into these principles that I have mentioned in brief. You'll see at the tabs at the top where you can see how I'm going to move through this presentation. And I've just talked briefly about the central figures of the faith and about some of the fundamental principles. I want to now touch just briefly about some issues of theory and method, and not to go into great detail, but to the extent that they do make some distinguishing points about how we see Baha'i history as a subset of history. And within the whole study of history in general, there is there's religious history, and then there's Baha'i history. How do we distinguish our preoccupations in Baha'i history from religious history in general, or history as a whole? Well, certainly the main themes of Baha'i history are consequences of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. For example, scriptural clarity, the fact that the Baha'i writings are so clear on Baha'i, fundamental Baha'i beliefs and tenets that there's little room for theological dispute. Now, there's a lot of debate on how we act as Baha'is, what the programs of action are, and understanding the Baha'i teachings, but the extensive scholarship on theological dispute that was a sort of a hallmark of Christian history, Islamic history, it may be far less evident in Baha'i literature. And secondly, the consequences of not having clergy in the Baha'i revelation is that the Baha'i community is self-administering and self-educating. I mention this because if you do read a history of Christianity, you'll be hearing about the rise of clerical orders and the rise of religious authority as the mainstream of Christian history. And of course, all the education in Christian history up until very recent times was education of that clergy itself. So it's very different when we look at Baha'i history, that so much emphasis in our community is on a self-education, that we have this responsibility to learn not only about the Baha'i revelation, but how it has an impact on the world around us. And I think, thirdly, that a strong theme of the consequence of the revelation of Baha'u'llah is individual obligation. It's not a matter of just simply belonging to a large community that somehow as a group observes the values and tenets of our faith, but it's an individual obligation to promote the Baha'i teachings, to help the advance of civilization. And I mention these because these have an impact on how we view the Australian Baha'i community, its history over 100 years. I think also consequences of our global consciousness is that this is not the history of one ethnic group, one nation, and we're aware that if we're looking at Australian Baha'i history, we're only looking at a subset of a much larger enterprise, which is a global world faith. And then this principle of unity has a big impact on the history of the Australian Baha'i community because of the non-partisan engagement. And those who have been part of the Australian Baha'i community over the decades will have heard the question, what do Baha'is do? What do you engage in? Because we don't get engaged in partisan ways or in disputes and contention. And there's an inbuilt mildness in speech and action, which has an impact on the way that the community interacts within itself and within Australian society as a whole. So I've just talked a little bit about some of the relationship with some of the central teachings and how I think they impact on the actions of the Australian Baha'i community. And this is the last of the theoretic points before we get into some of the substance of the history. So there is a field called historiography, which is in a sense the study of history, a meta study, not just history, but the study of history, the study of the sources of history and the study of methods. We can read Baha'i scripture for its historical component. Baha'u'llah speaks about his of the leaders of the nations and empires of his time. And certainly Abdul Baha does as well, talks about the accounts of his own life and the accounts of the Baha'i community in his time. And certainly, of course, the writings of Shoghi Effendi are historical in nature, even as they look at the future. We also then have primary sources, which are all the first-hand accounts, the diaries, the letters, the photos, the interviews, which is so much a part of our ability to write Baha'i history. Without those, we don't have the sources to be accurate in what we want to portray in our narration. And then of the importance of secondary sources, the newspapers, the books, the articles, the official records. And this is becoming increasingly exciting in the digital era because so much more is becoming made available to us. Now, another really important aspect of historiography or the historical method is factual accuracy for a number of reasons, but one is the idea that in critical thinking, you need to start with an accurate understanding of the object of study, so that we do need to ascertain the facts accurately as we go forward into an interpretive frame. This is a big field of study as to whether you can be objective. Is there a thing called objectivity in history, particularly in religious history? If you are a follower of a faith, how can you be objective? Well, the simple answer is objectivity is not possible. It's impossible. What is crucial is that the reasoning that we use to explain the course of history is plausible and understandable and based on the facts at hand. And this is very important for understanding the role of generalization. See, for example, if any one of us gives an account of the history of our community from purely our own subjective point of view, it is just one important point of view, but it's not generalizable in the same way as looking at the points of view of a number of people and bringing them together. And then there's the question of whether, what do we include in our interpretive frames? Are we going to use the lenses of sociology or economics, politics, ecology, theology, cultural studies? These are all different ways of seeing society. And there have been a couple of sociological investigations of the Australian Bahai community, in addition to a few historical investigations as well. And then another very important question is, why are we writing history? What are we looking for? Is it to confirm our faith, or to celebrate expansion and growth, to look for success, signs of success? Now, there are some pitfalls in writing religious history. One of them is termed triumphalist history, where an author might simply look at the high points of a religious community as a series of triumphs without any struggles, challenges. But when we look at the way in which Shoghi Effendi has written God Passes By and shows the intense struggles that the early Babis had to overcome, and then indeed the early Baha'is in the formative age had to overcome. There was triumph and there was achievement, but there was also struggle and the overcoming of obstacles. So we had to really think together about why are we writing histories, why are we writing biographies, what do we want to learn, and how do we do it in a way that anybody can pick up this book and say, well, that is a very interesting and fair account of that religious community. I think it's important that the Baha'i literature not be written purely for a Baha'i audience, but be of interest to others as well. Now, we are very fortunate in Australia to have a wonderfully organized archive in the basement of the Baha'i House of Worship. It's been responsibly cared for since the 1930s and built up. And one of the sessions that we'll have in this series with Satu Hesaramiri, who is the archivist at the current time, working on the after the wonderful work of Margaret Anderson of so many years. And it's because of the Treasures Archive that we can have any possibility of writing substantial histories of our local communities or of the national community as a whole. And when we delve into the archive, we find treasures. In February, I uncovered this letter from Shoghi Effendi, 1925, to Maisie Armand, which had not been realized before. It was there in this folder. And so I take this photo to celebrate the fact that we had found one that had been there all the time, but in the papers. And that's the work of the archives to investigate and uncover these. And of course, we're doing a second edition. The cover is going to be different, but there will be a second edition of Letters of Shoghi Effendi to Australasia, Messages to the Antipodes, hopefully out by the end of this year. Well, just one, you don't have to read through all of these questions at once, but there's a big difference between asking the question, when did Clara and Hyde Dunn first visit Brisbane? Where else did they travel in Queensland? These questions have been asked of us this year. And we don't have all the answers to every place that they traveled. The records are not complete. And you could ask yourself, who were the first members of your local community? And when was your assembly formed? But the type of questions that I put on this page eventually become more complex, and they're not just matters of fact, but they become matters of analysis. How did Hilda Brooks respond to queries by Christian clergy? What change has membership in the Baha'i faith brought to the lives of Australians? How have the Baha'i teachings been received in Australian society? These are not factual questions, they're interpretive questions that require us to deliver on the substantial answers to these questions that are asked and answered for our mutual benefit, so that we can learn from our history, not merely record it, not merely celebrate it, but learn from it as we go forward. And the final question there, don't need to read through them, all of them, but after being present for 100 years, what contribution has the Baha'i community made to Australian society? I don't think we've got the full answer to that yet, but that's why we're doing these types of sessions. Now, one way to help us through the complex to and fro of daily life is this periodization that Shoghi Effendi gives to us. He regards the heroic age as those first, second, and third epochs that are associated with the ministry of the Bab, the ministry of Baha'u'llah, the ministry of Abdul Baha. Because that's from 1844 to 1921. And you may be thinking, well, that's not to do with the Australian Baha'i community, that's in the history, that's to do with Persia and the Holy Land. But look in the right-hand column. The Australian features that in the first epoch of the heroic age, the reports of the Babis in Australian newspapers. These slides should be filling your screen. If somebody can help with the chat to make sure that everybody can see these slides in sufficient size. We find also during the ministry of Baha'u'llah, there are reports about the Babi faith and the persecution of Babis in Australian newspapers. And then during the ministry of Abdul Baha, we find not only reports about Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, but we start to find articles in the religious press, and there are individual correspondence from Australia to Baha'is in North America in particular. And Clara and Hyde Dunn arrived in Australia in 1920 during the heroic age, before the passing of the master Abdul Baha. Now we also have this articulation of the formative age that Shoghi Effendi defines for us as starting with the passing of Abdul Baha and the establishment of the administrative order under the guardianship of Shoghi Effendi. And a number of periods or epochs have been articulated by the Universal House of Justice. The characteristics of those epochs are listed in the central column, and the characteristics, some of the characteristics of the Australian community are in the right-hand column. So we see that following on the arrival of the Dunns during the first epoch of the formative age, 1921 to roughly 1944, 1946 is the establishment of the first communities and the establishment of the National Spiritual Assembly. The second epoch, starting approximately 1946 and going through to 1963, was associated with, in Australia, a 6-year plan, 1947-1953, the first systematic teaching plan in this country, followed by the 10-year crusade. Now, no need to go through all the detail of the plans, which is purely an administrative device to bring coherence to the actions of the Australian Bahai community, but to point out that there is this structure to our understanding of the periodization of Baha'i history. And of course, we're coming up to the centenary of the passing of Abdul Baha in 2021, and who knows whether the Universal House of Justice might make an announcement on whether this brings the fifth epoch to a conclusion and the exciting emergence of new characteristics and goals for the sixth epoch. But that is, in brief, something to do with theory and method before we move into some of the data about the Australian Bahai community. I've got on the screen here just one example of a newspaper. It's from the Sydney paper called the Morning Chronicle in April of 1946. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that, 1846. And it talks about a Mohammedan schism. A new sect has lately set itself up in Persia, at the head of which is a merchant who had returned from a pilgrimage to Mecca. So you may be surprised to see that the Australian press was carrying press reports about the Bab prior to his martyrdom in 1850. There's no need to go through all of the detail of the text on screen, because you can catch the detail later from the PowerPoint. We only have time to highlight some of these points. So what you see on the screen now are some of the press reports referring to the Babi faith from 1846 up to 1899. 30 or 40 or 50 references there, and there must be more to be found. And this is all due to the wonders of the digital age that we can discover these references. And so we come to the work of Clara and Hyde Dunn, and this session tonight does not cover their achievements in detail. They have been subject to a previous talk, which is online, and there will be other talks later in the year focusing on the achievements of Clara and Hyde Dunn. So tonight, in brief, between 1920 and 1934, they nurtured the first generation of Australian and New Zealand Baha'is. They established the Baha'i communities in Sydney, Auckland, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, and Hobart. And they helped establish these local assemblies in Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, Perth, and Adelaide. This is quite an achievement for a 14-year period, culminating in the establishment of the National Spiritual Assembly for Australia and New Zealand. The book about the Dunns is forthcoming just as soon as it can be completed. But tonight we're doing an overview. So we're not going into so much detail about the Dunns, but the work that followed on their early achievements. The early promotion activities of the Dunns in all states except for the Northern Territory was accompanied by a remarkable visit in 1924 by Martha Root. And she arrived in Perth. She had been in China. And she attracted unprecedented newspaper coverage. She gave, for example, in Perth, 36 lectures in a month. And then she made 25 appearances in Melbourne, 24 in Auckland and Wellington, 2 in Tasmania, 8 in Sydney. It's a tremendous output of, and creating awareness of the Baha'i faith in the mid-1920s as the Dunns were trying to establish the first assemblies. And we see in the photo Clara and Hyde Dunn with Effie Baker and Martha Root standing behind. Now, some of this early history has been written about and spoken about. And so on your screen, there are a couple of video presentations, one by myself and one by Mariette Leong, Recollections of Hand at the Cause Clara Dunn, which was sponsored by the Wilmette Institute. So there are quite a number of presentations, and there's certainly a number of publications dating back more than 20 years in the academic literature. Now we move forward to the emergence of Baha'i institutions. And this is interesting that the first local assemblies, Melbourne, established 9 December 1923, disbanded approximately 1927 and not re-established till 1948. Perth, established during the time of the Dunns, but later disbanded, re-established 1936 and then re-established 1949. There are stories to be told there about the struggles of the first adherents to understand their faith, to understand Baha'i administration, their role in it, and all of those challenges that were associated with learning to work harmoniously in groups. Adelaide, established December 1924, lapsed, re-established, later devolved into a number of assemblies. Sydney, established in 1925, it also collapsed and was later re-established. Auckland, established in 1925. So there was quite a challenge in setting up these local assemblies, and we haven't got too much detail. The records are in the archives, but we need people to come in and look in more detail so that we can learn about these early years. And of course, the formation of the National Spiritual Assembly, Australia and New Zealand. And that formation was very much guided by Shoghi Effendi, and sometimes through letters that he asked Effie Baker to write gently to the Australian friends. It was a very big decision to form the National Spiritual Assembly. Not all the individuals were prepared for it, and not all the communities. It was a large decision, and they felt it was quite a burden, economically, but also in terms of what they understood of the faith at that time, to take on that responsibility. So Shoghi Effendi directed Keith Ransom Kaler to Australia in 1931 to visit all of these communities and to explain to them what Baha'i administration was and the role of Baha'i administration in establishing the community on a national basis. Now, Keith Ransom Kaler was such an outstanding personality and a fine presenter of Baha'i principles that she attracted people of capacity into the communities. And on the basis of this impetus, also there was an important pilgrimage in 1932 that Clara Dunn made to Haifa and came back with renewed vigor to form the National Assembly. And so the first national convention was held in Sydney in 1934. I do have a photo here of Mrs. Keith Ransom Kaler with the Sydney Baha'is. It's a marvelous photo. We see Stanley and Mariette Bolton in this photo. Stanley is behind, Keith Ransom Kaler, of course, sitting in the front, Mariette to her left. Oswald Whittaker, the first Australian Bahai, is standing at the back on the left. But some of the other people in this photo, we don't have the names of all the people who are here, but obviously they felt it was an important enough event with Keith Ransom Kaler to make this wonderful photo, such a wonderful photo to mark this early establishment of the Sydney community. And we have the first National Convention of Australia and New Zealand. But the point of my presentation is to say that while we celebrate this event, we do not know in great detail of these early Baha'is. We know the names of Charlotte Moffat, Gladys Movie, Jay Chandler, Dorothy Dugdale, O. Hicks, who's in Randwick, by the way, for the Randwick friends, Ethel Dorr, Perce and Maisie Armand, the first Adelaide Baha'is. But we don't yet have a substantial biography of these early believers. Guy Inman, Mrs. Brown, Rose Hawthorne, Amy Wilkins, Gladys Moody, Hilda Gilbert, P. Rickman, Emily Miller, Linda Whittaker, who was the wife of Oswald, Will Hawthorne, and Bertram Dewing. We know a little about some of these, but not all of them in detail. And these were the first members who came together at the first convention. So the theme that I'm putting out for this first photo of this wonderful convention is that we do need to know more about these early Baha'is. This is the first National Assembly: Percy Armand, Ethel Blundell, Oswald Whittaker, Robert Brown, Silver Jackman, Charlotte Moffat, Hyde Dunn, Margaret Stevenson, Hilda Brooks. Now I've circled Margaret Stevenson in the hope that Heather Simpson might sometime come online and share her research that she's doing about Margaret. In a couple of weeks' time, Vicky Majewski will come online from Darwin and talk about the genealogical work that she's done on people like Robert Brown, Oswald Whittaker, the Armands, and she has been able to uncover, using those tools that she has knowledge of, to bring to us knowledge of these early Baha'is that we haven't had in our records thus far. It's very exciting. There's much more to come. Well, this is just an overview tonight, so let me, in brief, talk about some of these main themes without having the time to go into detail. Now, this period that we're looking at from 1934, with the formation of the National Assembly, up to 1947, when they had their first systematic teaching plan, this is the period of the Second World War and all the deprivations of the war period, that you could not even travel interstate, you needed a permit. The National Assembly could not meet. You were not allowed to print because all print materials were being used for the war effort. There were only intermittent NSA meetings. They had to meet by correspondence. There was growing relations between the NSA and the LSAs. And if you remember, the LSAs were formed before the NSA. So there might have been a tendency by some LSAs to say to the NSA, well, we were established first. Let us let you know, let us tell you how we do things. And establishing the respective roles of the national body and the local bodies is a process that took some time. The establishment of the Baha'i Quarterly, the magazine, and the tremendous amount of work that went into bringing this communication to this far-flung communities that hadn't met each other in person, apart from those few favoured people who were privileged to come to the National Convention. The rest didn't meet each other for many, many years. The summer schools beginning at Yerumbul and ever since. The tragic passing of Hyde Dunn in 1941 and the impact on the community, losing Father Dunn, who had done so much to hold the community together and until that time. The first coordinated teaching campaign, and there are wonderful stories of how the National Assembly members started these. They travelled to Broken Hill, they travelled to Melbourne, they travelled to other cities and towns where they wanted to open up Baha'i communities. And those stories are told in the early Baha'i bulletins. The interesting questions of boundaries of Baha'i membership and behaviour, because the first adherents hadn't signed membership cards, because the first adherents pre-existed the local assemblies and Baha'i administration. And so there are questions there around what is Baha'i membership and what is Baha'i behaviour, and the boundaries there in any religious community. And those were all being looked at in the period 34 to 47. An outstanding theme of the periods then and ever since is women in leadership roles, at a time when women had very limited roles in public life, in business, and in the churches, and they had leading roles with responsibility in this fledgling Baha'i community. There's also a very important convention in 1946 in which there was a lot of concern about let's say the electoral process, the number of delegates, the way in which the delegates spoke to each other, and about the electoral process. And that is covered in Messages to the Antipodes. You can read some of the the detail there. I'm going to just tell you about one or two people tonight that you may not have known too much about, and because our time is limited as we go through this presentation. But you may not have heard of Emily Axford, who lived 1870 to 1949. Now, she became a Baha'i immediately upon meeting Clara and Hyde Dunn in Auckland in January of 1923 on their Hyde's one and only visit to New Zealand. And she served on Auckland's local assembly from its establishment through the 30s and into the 40s. She was also elected a delegate to convention. And later, when the national headquarters was established in 1944, she moved to Sydney and became the secretary there. She served on the National Assembly for roughly a decade, including the difficult war years. In addition, she was the first editor of Bahai Quarterly. Now here we get to some of the outstanding achievements. Apart from, yes, she was helping with the Bahai administration, she was a wonderful devoted Bahai, but she gave excellent talks relating the Bahai teachings to the conditions in society. At convention, she gave a talk, 1937, The Non-Political Character of the Bahai Faith. It was noticed by somebody, it was printed in American Bahai News at Shoghi Effendi's request, and it subsequently appeared in the Bahai World, Volume 7. She helped write Bahai viewpoints to courts of appeal for conscientious objectors. Some of the Bahai men sought conscientious objector status during the war years. At the same time, she was a vice president of New Zealand's National Council of Women, a member of the Howard League for Penal Reform, and other organisations. She was an Esperantist. She did radio broadcasts, and those broadcasts were reprinted as pamphlets. And other achievements. But these wonderful early leaders of our community in Australia and New Zealand. So I mentioned there were these early first coordinated teaching campaigns, and they were sparked by this one cable of Shoghi Effendi, 1943, concentrate, next meeting, measures ensure multiplication Bahai centres. And on the basis of that cable, the National Assembly decided to form new Bahai groups in Broken Hill, Grafton, Junee, Lismore, Tamworth, Wagga, Brisbane, Port Adelaide, Hobart, Fremantle and Perth. Now, I've done a survey to see how many of these were actually achieved, and it doesn't always match up, but others might have been opened nonetheless. But one cable led to this activity. When we read the cables of Shoghi Effendi in the book Messages to the Antipodes, we get to appreciate the impact that these cables could have and the steer that he gave, because there was discussion at that time as to whether the community should just concentrate and become bigger in the major centres. We need a large community of strength in the middle of each city, as compared to the idea of spreading out and taking the message out into the suburbs and into the country towns. And so in response, there's one, I've just given one little snippet there from Secretary Hilda Brooks to Shoghi Effendi. Mrs. Dunn is in Brisbane. We've opened a Bahai Centre in Melbourne. Visits have been made to Broken Hill and Canberra, country towns, New South Wales and South Australia, etc. And this was all in response to that one cable of Shoghi Effendi. But this was the first coordinated teaching campaign, but it wasn't systematic for the community as a whole. In 1944, there's very significant acquisition of a national Hazrat al-Quds, a national headquarters at Tulang Road in Paddington. And many of the friends who are online right now remember this building with affection. This became the centre of the national activities and also a centre for the Sydney activities through into the 1970s. It was purchased at the instigation of Shoghi Effendi. Again, Shoghi Effendi leading the direction of these important decisions, because it cost a lot of money to purchase and then to upkeep, but it formed a basis for the administration. The National Assembly met there, the books centre was there, Firesides Convention was held there, the archives were held there, etc. And in the front room, of course, Mother Dunn lived in the front room at the left on the ground floor, and after her, Effie Baker. So there's a lot of history associated with this building. Now, I alluded to the establishment of the first local assemblies, and I then said that a lot of them went into abeyance. Now, there's a whole story with this slide. During the first systematic teaching plan, which was 6 years, 1947 to 1953, that there were re-established local assemblies in the major cities, such as Melbourne, Brisbane, Hobart and Perth. You see, all established 1948-49 with tremendous effort. Each one has a story which will appear in the book that results, because each one is a story of sacrifice and coordination to reform those assemblies. But you see three other interesting assemblies there: Caringbah, Yarrambil, and Woodville. And these were in smaller outer suburbs. And there's a story there because there were champions of the faith who said, well, we really feel now that we need to form assemblies and communities outside of the major central metropolitan areas. And that was a theme of the late 1940s and the early 1950s. And we can learn a lot about that interesting period of Australian Bahai history. I'm going to just tell you briefly about another wonderful early Bahai. You may not have heard too much about Ethel Dore. Maybe the South Australian Baha'is have heard, and I'd be interested to know whether you do know about Ethel Dore. She was born in 1902, introduced to the Bahai teachings by her aunt, Maisie Armand, who was the first Bahai, together with Maisie's husband, Perce. And she was active in the League of Nations. In fact, she was the president of the South Australian branch. And she got invited to Geneva in 1937 to attend a meeting of the League of Nations. This is it, just before the Second World War. And she took the opportunity to go on pilgrimage. She was the third Australian pilgrim after Effie Baker and Clara Dunn. Now, shortly after arriving back from that wonderful pilgrimage, she joined ABC Radio. And over a period of years, she rose to be the supervisor of talks for the South Australian ABC Radio. During all those years, she was one of Adelaide Community's regular public speakers. She was on the local assembly. She was a delegate to National Convention. She served on National Convention for those years, 48 to 53. In 1953, she accompanied Mother Dunn to New Delhi Conference, one of the conferences at the start of the World Crusade. But tragically, she was suffering from some, I think, leukemia, and she could not beat it. She struggled for years. She formed a close friendship with Rahia Khanum. She received a number of letters of guidance from Shoghi Effendi, but tragically her life was cut short at the age of 52. There's a wonderful obituary that was in her ABC. The ABC had its own newspaper, and it wrote this about her. In the field of the spoken word, Miss Dore had considerable ability. She was a contributor to the talks programs prior to taking up her regular appointment in 1943. She was also a good speaker in public and had a capacity for phrasing and expression, which gave her material a most attractive quality. Her ability for constructive synthesis was one of her greatest assets. Gifted with a gracious manner and a capacity for constructive thinking, Miss Dore was admirably suited to a post as talk supervisor, and the special personal qualities which she was able to bring to this work will be greatly missed. In her personal life, Miss Dore was an active worker for the Baha'i faith, and in 1953 made a visit to India and Israel. And I find Ethel Dore to be one of those early Australian Baha'is who managed, despite the personal difficulties, to lead a very active Baha'i community life, as well as an active professional life and active in civil society as well. We have these wonderful role models, and the more that we can learn about these early Baha'is, the better. And this is a good year to do it. Well, we move forward to the period of the 10-year crusade, 1953 to 1963. So much happened in that 10 years. The pioneers to the Pacific Islands I'll refer to in brief in the next slide. The home front pioneers whose stories have not been told, those who moved from the cities to the country towns. The appointment of first auxiliary board members, Collis Featherston and Thelma Perks, who were auxiliary board members to Clara Dunn in 1954. The tragic passing of Shoghi Effendi affected the whole Baha'i world and also, of course, the Australian Baha'i community, who then looked to the hands of the who served as ministries, the Ministry of the Custodians. Now, during this period as well, such a busy period, was the construction of the Sydney House of Worship, the Major Glasgow. I will have a slide for that a little later, and leading up to the election of the Universal House of Justice. So much happened in this 10-year period. And this is the renowned National Assembly elected in 1953. You see the names listed on the right, and 6 of these members of the National Assembly, when challenged by the goals of the World Crusade, Lillian Wiss went to Samoa. Elsie Dive went to Cook Islands. Alvin and Gertrude Blum ended up in Solomon Islands. Lad Park went to French Polynesia. Stanley Bolton went to Tonga. They had to be replaced on the National Assembly by another group of dedicated Baha'is who then took forward the plan. Now, Jim Hickey had young children and Collis Featherson had young children, and it was agreed that they would stay in country, and they became the bedrocks of the National Assembly for the next couple of years. That included the years of construction of the House of Worship, amongst many other things. So many more stories that can be told in this slide. And it wasn't just the members of the National Assembly, it was other members of the Australian community who also went. Frank Wist, for example, and others who went and pioneered at this time. And there's wonderful letters from Shoghi Effendi. Midpoint of the plan, the central paragraph there, the entire Baha'i world beholds with pride and admiration the great victories won by the Australian and New Zealand communities, both in their homelands and in so many islands of the Pacific, and shares my confidence that the historic accomplishments, particularly since the inception of the 10-year plan, are but a prelude to still nobler exploits and still mightier victories. And these letters of encouragement had such an impact on the Baha'is of that time. In 1957, the National Assembly took the decision that the metropolitan communities would devolve into those other communities based on municipal boundaries, so that the one area of Sydney became 17 metropolitan communities. They didn't mean they were assemblies, they were communities. And the same with Melbourne, the same with Adelaide, Woodville, Perth. And so there was a large increase in the number of local Baha'i communities who then had the challenge of forming their own local spiritual assemblies. You can see the linking up to the themes that I set out under the historiography section, that the level of personal engagement that was required in this new faith that had no professional clergy, that those who became Baha'is at this time very quickly became engaged personally in the establishment of the administrative order that would propel their faith forward in this country. And we come to the privilege of constructing a house of worship in this country. Now, at the beginning of the plan, there was no intention of building this house of worship. There was an intention only of acquiring temple land. And Greta Lake has told me a story, which I'll put on tape now. Greta Lake said that they went and found this land, which was just bushland, and the owner was very, very wary of what it was being for. She said, look, we're going to use it in the future. We're not going to do anything soon. It's just going to be bushland, because he was living next to it and he didn't want something busy happening next to him. Well, the next thing that happened was that Shoghi Effendi had called for, in the plan, the building of a house of worship in Tehran. And there was major persecution of the Baha'is in 1955 in Iran. And Shoghi Effendi said, if we cannot build there, we will build two. We will build one in Australia and one in Kampala, Uganda. And so the Australians got busy with the design and the construction. And Greta told me how difficult it was to go to that man who had sold them the land, because she said, sorry, we had no idea that we were doing it so quickly. But that's part of the story of the building of this house of worship. Now, the building, the Australians started to call this Mashik al-Azhar the silent teacher. It taught on its own. There was a massive increase in press coverage surrounding, and I have many examples. Because of time, I can't give them all to you now. The Brisbane Telegraph reporting in 1958, 22 miles from Sydney, and they give some of the Baha'i teachings there. The church, the house of worship will be the center of a hospital, a school for orphan children, the college for higher education. It'll be the third built by the faith, etc. The Lord Mayor of Sydney held a reception for international dignitaries present at the dedication that included Rahia Khanum. And the press coverage was considerable. There were over 100 visitors from 20 countries, a total of 1,800 people at the opening. Now, you know, in many stories, the author makes a cameo appearance, and this is my little cameo. You can see who's in this photo here: Peter Khan, Janet Khan, Effie Baker, Bibi Khan, Peter Khan's mother, Frank Khan, Judy Hassall, David Hassall with his back, Jane Hassall, and myself. Well, let's press on. So sometimes you don't see the Baha'i house of worship from the air. This is just going to Google Maps and seeing the land surrounding. And there's extensive holdings. And these holdings have been developed. It wasn't in the first place. We don't yet have a historical map showing the initial purchase of land and subsequent purchase of land by the National Assembly to ensure that those future ancillary institutions can be built around the house of worship. But now the house of worship has become such a prominent landmark in the north of Sydney. And I want to tell one more tale. So this is a larger map, and you can see the Baha'i house of worship marked, and you can see the Sydney harbour further to below on this map. And why is the house of worship in this location? You may have asked yourself. Jim Heggie told me that Shoghi Effendi wanted the house of worship to be in a site where it would have been visible to Clara and Hyde Dunn as they made their arrival in Sydney. So Jim did some homework to ascertain that the boat on which they arrived came down the coast from the north. And because of that, the search for land was on the north side and not the south side. And that's part of the history as to why it's up in Mona Vale. Well, moving on in this brief overview, and you'll see the large period here is the epoch from 1963 to 1986. And there are 3 plans during this period: a 9-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 7-year plan. These were plans to coordinate the work of the Australian Bahai community. For example, to attain the legal status for local assemblies, because in Australia, as a federation, the laws are different. To continue to send international pioneers to international goals. To broaden the number of minorities who are members of the Australian Bahai community. To establish a publishing trust. And we see part of this is just one small snippet from this period. A new generation of pioneers departed for Fiji, Gilbert and Ellice Islands, Laos, Malawi, Papua New Guinea, many other places. And those stories are yet to be told. I think that now when we start to move past 1963, we may not be talking so much about history. We're getting closer to current times, and we lose a bit of historical perspective. Now, some of the other main themes, asking that question, what do Baha'is do? What is it to be part, what is the historical development of this community? For the average member of the community, it's Baha'i community life. It's the observance and celebration of feasts, of holidays, involvement in study programs, the participation in conferences, summer and winter schools, which through this period from the 1960s through the 1980s was a lively part of the Australian Bahai experience, traveling to conferences, sometimes called by the councillors, sometimes called by youth committees, sometimes called by the National Assembly, sometimes called by a very active Bahai community in a country area. A second theme was proclamation activities. That during this period, to be an active member of the Bahai community was to participate in public meetings, to participate in travel teaching, to present the Bahai teachings to officials such as local mayors, members of parliament, school principals, to attend the teaching conferences, the youth conferences. Another crucial area of expansion and diversification in this period was the welcoming of indigenous Baha'is into the community. And there are so many stories to be told. I've mentioned a few of the first of the indigenous Australian Baha'is and those who spent much of their energy working with Aboriginal communities in the 1960s. And we're going to have a special presentation in a few weeks' time from June Perkins about Fred Murray, a wonderful story of one of these early Australian Baha'is. Now, another major theme for this period is Baha'i administration, the service on assemblies and committees. Up until 1963, we're talking about Baha'is in their tens and their hundreds. There was a big chance that if you are a member of a Baha'i community, you were serving on an assembly. And certainly that you were serving on a committee. And there's other elements of the elaboration of administration, such as the introduction of unit conventions, when there were the number of communities grew sufficiently large that you needed a special secondary institution through which to elect your delegates to the National Convention. Another ongoing theme, it's not one that we focus on, but the legal recognition, for example, of Baha'i holidays, Baha'i marriage, and as I mentioned, the legal recognition of LSAs in the National Assembly. And during this period too, if you look at the dates, 1963 and 1986 includes the period of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1979, so that we start to come into the period of Iranian Baha'i refugees. I will come back to that theme in a few slides' time. Another crucial theme of international conferences during this period. There was a conference in Sydney in 1958 at the midpoint of the World Crusade, brought members from around the Pacific for the first time to meet the Australian and New Zealand friends. There was a conference attached to the temple dedication in September of 1961, 1,800 people present. There was a conference in Sydney in 1967 to mark the centenary of Baha'u'llah's proclamation to the kings and the rulers from 1867, the 1860s, and other international conferences that have been held since. This is just in the period up to 86. But this gives us a moment to think, what is the function of a conference? I mean, what do these do for the community? Particularly, for example, if you're not a member of the Baha'i community, say, yes, you went to a conference. What does it do? What role does it play in the life of the community? So a few thoughts on that the conferences created momentum. They generated spirit in the community. They linked the community with the center of the faith. In other words, the world center of the faith, the universal house of justice. They certainly helped to coordinate our action activities because those conferences included discussion of current plans and future hopes. Conferences were a site for creating friendships in this vast continent and across continents, across countries, over the seas. By going to a conference, whether you're a child, a youth, or an adult, you made friends. And those friendships were sustained through subsequent decades. These conferences helped build confidence within individuals, communities, and institutions. They attracted publicity to the Baha'i community, and they attracted public interest. So what brings these groups of people together? They attract the attention of leaders and authorities who might have been asked to make an opening speech or to be in some way part of these conferences. And certainly there were sites of experience sharing and learning. So the conferences had a crucial role to play in the formation of Baha'i identity and the energization of the Baha'i community. And in addition to those held in Australia and New Zealand were the major world congresses, the First World Congress in London, the Second World Congress in New York, which was still very much part of the Australian experience because there were Australians who went to these conferences and came back with so much vitalization and direction for the work of the community. Now, I started to allude to the arrival of the Iranian refugees. The media in Australia started to regard the Australian Baha'i community not as, for example, in the 30s and 40s, it was referred to as a cult. Then it was referred to as a sect. When more understanding of the Baha'i faith came about, those terms, no one refers to the Baha'i community in those terms because we've moved beyond that, and the understanding is that it's a world faith. but it was increasingly referred to as, in a sense, an ethnic minority by the Baha'i community as an ethnic group. I'm not clear on the figures of the arrival of Iranian Baha'is, perhaps near 10,000. Not all refugees, maybe 5,000. This is a work in progress. We need to look at these figures. But not all Persian Baha'is are refugees. There were a certain number from before 1979 that came either directly from Iran or from third countries such as Indonesia or elsewhere. And since the 1980s, they have come from third countries under family reunion programs, whether it's from Turkey or other countries, from the US, from the UK, and those coming on the strength of their educational and commercial credentials, as well as under their family links. So the arrival of the Iranians has made a substantial impact on the Australian Baha'i community, on its character, on its mode of operation, and how it's perceived by the public. There's many dimensions to that, but one that is irrefutable is that within a few decades, the Iranian Baha'is have made significant contributions to Australian society. You think of their contributions in higher education, in business, in science, technology, the arts. We have professors in so many different fields. We have other Iranian Baha'is who excelled in the rural towns and in their occupations, in the arts. This is all part now of the heritage of the Australian Baha'i community. Well, we're moving up through the years and looking at these broad themes. Now, I mentioned the first appointment of the auxiliary board members. There were just 2 in 1954. And then that was increased to 4. And I was able to mention in a presentation this morning to a group of Pacific Baha'is in Australia, that the first Pacific board members were also appointed in 1964, Nui Tuatara. And we see this expansion of the appointed arm. 1968, the number of Australasian auxiliary board members increased to 63. Also in 1968, the first appointments to the Continental Board of Councillors. And we really need as a community have a fuller understanding of the service of Thelma Perks and Howard and Suhail Alai. 1980, the number of Australasian board members increased to 81. That's across the Australasian region. The major theme from the 1980s was Baha'i involvement in peace activities. There was the International Year of Peace, 1986. And in preparation for that, for example, the National Assembly submitted a statement on peace to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence. And if you were to look at the number of submissions of the Baha'i community to the Australian Parliament, whether on peace matters or on other matters, and then later in detail about the protection of the Baha'is of Iran, the engagement with the Australian Parliament has been considerable. And the awareness of Australia's members of the federal parliament and of state parliaments is considerable, their understanding of the faith. In 1985, the statement, the Promise of World Peace, written by the Universal House of Justice, was presented to our Governor General, at the time Sir Ninian Stephen. And the following year, Sir Ninian came to the House of Worship, attended a service observing International Year of Peace. There was a peace exposition. Maybe a number of you who are listening to this presentation were present at that. More than 10,000 visitors. The first time that the temple grounds were open to such a public event. And it inspired other peace events around the country. And for its efforts, the National Assembly received one of only 3 Peace Messenger Awards that the United Nations gave for activities in Australia in recognition of these activities. Well, I haven't mentioned growth. Now, the Australian Baha'is would say the growth has been quite slow and not as fast as in other countries, or not in proportion to the efforts that put in. By 1963, there were 31 local assemblies around the country. And as I said, the numbers of Baha'is numbered in their tens and hundreds. By 1973, there were 61. And at the current time, there's approximately 200. Now, the number of local assemblies is determined by municipal boundaries. So there will be a time when there will be no more expansion of the number of local assemblies because it will reach the number of municipal areas. The number of individual members could continue to grow. In 2016, the National Census reported a Baha'i population of about 14,000, although the Australian Bahai community quoted at the time a figure of 20,000. But our theme tonight is constructing a history of the Australian Bahai community. When you get into thousands of members, you can no longer tell the story of individuals, and you need to find ways to tell the story of the community. Those privileged individuals who were at the beginning of the faith in this country, whose unique teaching activities or administrative services now number in their hundreds, if not thousands, across the country, each of whose stories is equally valid to tell. Now, I'm going to come to the end of my presentation with a brief reflection on the ways in which the Baha'i principles either converge or diverge from Australian values. So this first slide is suggesting areas of convergence. The first is race. Consider when the Dunns arrived in Australia to a white Australia policy at a time when non-whites were prohibited from entering the country. Persians were regarded as Asiatics and were not allowed to migrate to this country. How different today, when people of all backgrounds are welcomed into this country and Australia celebrates its multicultural texture, the extent of Asian immigration, the broad acceptance of Aboriginal rights. I don't say full acceptance, but broad acceptance of Aboriginal rights. That's still an issue, and understanding the Baha'i perspective on the rights of Indigenous Australians is part of that. But just that first area, surely that's an area in which the Australian society has come to converge with the Baha'i view of racial equality. The second area of convergence is gender equality. How different in the 1920s, when the first women who became Baha'is had to learn how to give a public talk, had to learn to use a typewriter, had to learn to run a meeting, because they had not had these roles. How different today, in which women lead in so many areas of commercial life, public life in general, leadership of the country, the business community, and in the Australian community, taking such significant steps forward. Surely the principle of gender equality that is built into the Baha'i value system, social principles, the Australian community has started to catch up with this. There are still some areas in which, for example, women's pay is not equal, or women's domestic work is not valued in the same way. There are areas where this is not, it's not a perfect situation, but just consider the difference between the 1920s and the 2020s. So surely it's an area of convergence. And the third one is interfaith relations. Australia was known as a field of sectarianism, and what that meant was a gap, a chasm between Protestants and Catholics in this country. And religion did not mean anything other than Christianity. There was nothing else that was given any value in this country, but you are either Catholic or Protestant. And now there is an acceptance of the multiplicity of faiths, a respect, the growth of the multi-faith movement, but also multi-faith dialogue, in which the Baha'is have played, I would say, a leading role in ensuring that the leaders of the religious communities meet each other, understand each other, and spread that to their communities. Australia isn't known as a country of sectarian strife. So how different the 1920s from the 2020s? It's another area in which there's been this convergence, in which the majority of Australians fully agree with the Baha'i principle. And the fourth one I'm putting here is peace. In the 1920s, Australia was still coming out of the First World War and deciding whether to glorify war or to promote peace. And indeed, some of the first Australian Baha'is were those who shunned the experience of the First World War. And how different today that the young people, in fact, people of all ages, would much prefer peace to war. Do not any longer celebrate the sending of young men overseas to fight in someone else's war. There's a great convergence there, I think, in the Baha'i approach to peace and Australian acceptance of peace as a value in the world today. But there are areas of increasing divergence or ambivalent divergence, and this is a very interesting area. Marriage, family, and sexuality. Now, in the 1920s, marriage was still the union of a man and a woman. The idea of cohabitation was frowned on. Homosexual relationships were frowned on. And in the period between 1920 and 2020, there's been an apparent divergence between the Baha'i view, which upholds marriage as a union between a man and a woman, and acceptance in law, not only of homosexuality, but of same-sex marriage. And there's a challenge to the Baha'i community now as to what is the view on same-sex marriage? Are you not hindering the rights, the human rights of people to relationships of their choice? So this is an area in which there's a divergence, which is an area for engagement between the Baha'i views, the Baha'i principles, and our reasoning of those principles, the values behind them, and explaining that to an increasingly skeptical Australian society, which is increasingly tolerant of these lifestyles. The attitude to number 2, habit-forming drugs and gambling, is interesting. Alcohol is still widely accepted in Australia, but there's growing awareness of its dangers. Now, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, to not drink was to be regarded as a wowser, as a teetotaler who was against all enjoyment of life, to be shunned in social circles in Australia. But now there's less social stigma attached to non-consumption. That's why this one's an ambivalent one. There's growing concern at the impact of heavy drug use and irresponsible gambling and alcohol intake. It's coming together a little with Baha'i values, but not a complete embrace of them. And the third one that I've chosen to mention is partisan politics. Is there a growing convergence of Baha'i views with Australian views, or a divergence? Now, the Baha'i view is that we are seeking social cohesion based on harmonious approaches to conflict resolution and decision-making, which does not include political party processes. What is the attitude of the Australian public in broad? I think there's an ambivalence there. And what I mean by that is I think that most Australians are disillusioned with party politics, they're disillusioned with parliamentary process, but they have not moved toward the condition of looking for alternatives. So this is an area of engagement. Now, of course, Baha'is are becoming engaged in social discourse on social cohesion, and that will have to embrace this question of, if we don't engage in partisan politics, what's our answer for making decisions on difficult questions that the public faces and government faces? Are we going to be just completely aloof from the critical public policy questions of the day, or do we have a way of explaining how our decision-making processes will be helpful in making a transition in process? Well, I come to the end of my summary, and I've moved from a more historical analysis to looking at just some of the major themes of the current time. If you were to, if someone said, well, describe what is the characteristic of the Australian Baha'i community these days, what do you do? Which is one of the early questions that I asked. This coherent program of community building that Baha'is are engaged in, with the 4 key pillars of assisting with junior youth, the institute process, devotional meetings, children's classes, as a framework for the development of virtues at all levels of society, from the young to the mature. But the second thing, that's like it's the Baha'i community with community of interest. But there's another interesting dimension to this, that when you look at press coverage of the Australian Baha'i community, it's mostly press coverage in local press. There's extensive community engagement at local level. We're not getting much national press coverage, but those indexes that look at press coverage, the press articles, there are some communities around the country that have got a good relationship with their press, and their local communities are very well aware of what Baha'i communities are doing. We don't see that unless you look for it, unless it's brought out through studies that we can bring out and bring to the attention of a wider audience. The third theme is the work of the Office of the Australian Bahai Community, engagement in social discourse with leaders in this country, with young leaders, national leaders, religious leaders, and there are websites where you can look at that. And the interesting fourth one is the success of individual Baha'is, who ironically don't speak of their success, because it's built into this idea that Baha'is in the tradition of F.E. Baker are so unassuming and self-effacing, to make sure that their achievements and accomplishments are kept in the background to their service to the faith. But if you're looking in a historical perspective on the dynamics of the Australian Baha'i community, you find it is replete with the instances of Baha'is who have taken these principles into their personal life, and on the basis of that have engaged in their daily profession, responsibilities, and achieved considerable success and recognition. And I think that when we get a larger view of what is the Australian Baha'i community after 100 years, and we find more of these stories come to light and come to the surface, that those early examples that I gave of Ethel Dorr and others, that they're multiplied by hundreds now. I'm going to finish this presentation at this point. Thank you for listening. The idea of the presentation was to, in a sense, bring to the surface some of the themes that we might consider if we were to celebrate 100 years of the Australian Baha'i community. How do we do it? What does it look like? What do we look for in our history? I've emphasized that it's partly national, but a lot of it happens locally through our local communities. And there's also a lot of this accomplishment and achievement by individual Baha'is who have made their way in Australian society, which is broadly tolerant society. In fact, it's so tolerant that it doesn't really care much for what people's beliefs are. It just leaves people free. And think how different these 100 years has been in this country to the experience of Baha'i communities elsewhere in the world that have faced considerable hardships, opposition, or lack of resources, none of which we have in this country. And if we continue to have this discussion for another 6 months of the centenary year, it will leave us in a good position to contemplate what we should be seeking to achieve in the next 100 years. Friends, thank you for listening. I will stop the screen share now, and we will open up for some discussion. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Graham, I was just wondering whether I can ask a question. Between 1925 to 1940, a number of early spiritual assemblies elapsed and then reformed. What were the issues? What was the concerning issues at the time that these assemblies elapsed?
Thank you, Ahmed. There are a number of issues. One is, on the part of some individuals, a concern that the Baha'i faith was a spiritual movement that did not need to be organized. And this came from an earlier view from the early 1900s, that what was important was the the spiritual teachings of the Baha'i faith, but if you start to organize them, you are starting to start another church. And these people say, look, I've just left my church. I've gotten out of the church, and you want me to start a new one. So there was that misunderstanding. A second was tremendous, Shoghi Effendi talked about the extreme zeal of the early Australians who sometimes clashed in their views of how things should be done, clashed in ways that made it difficult for those communities to continue. And this is referred to by Shoghi Effendi in letters to the Antipodes about how the Australian Baha'is needed to learn to work with each other, to overlook their different personalities and temperaments, and to the goals of the community as a whole. And I think that on the whole, we've learned that now, because we still have different personalities. Maybe, if there's only 50 Baha'is in Australia, it's different to when there's 15 or 20,000. And the mentality was different when you got to a convention, or when you got to a local assembly meeting or a feast. And so there seems to be a difference in temperament. And, Ahmed, your question is good. And I see on screen there are so many friends who have been, I've only been part of this community for 50 years. I think there are others who have been 60 or 70 years. But this challenge of how to learn this idea of social cohesion, working together across differences of temperament and idea, has been a major challenge. I think it's been met and overcome, but it was a difficulty. So let me tell you something. When I wrote an honours thesis in 1984, I have to remember what year it was, and I shared my honours thesis with Peter Kahn. I said, well, what do you think? I was a young writer. And he said, well, it's very good. He says, but you've completely overlooked the tensions between Adelaide and Sydney. And, he said, well, historically, that was something that really had to be dealt with. And I'd not made much of it. And that gave me a lot to think about. Historically, we have to work these things through and see how the difficulties were overcome. Now, I had a second chance, and I just want to share this with you because it's the best place to do it. When Professor Firuz Kazemzadeh came to Melbourne, I had a chance to talk to him as a renowned historian. And I said, Professor Kazemzadeh, how do I deal with explaining conflict in the Australian Bahai community? And he said, well, look what Shoghi Effendi did with Bahai. He said that Shoghi Effendi laid out all of the stresses and strains that had to be overcome. And Professor Kazemzadeh said his own parents were aghast. They said, Shoghi Effendi, we had tried to keep these stories away from our children so they didn't know these terrible things. And now you've just laid them all out. But this was the lesson that, now the term that's being used in the Baha'i community is to read the reality. Now, how can you read the reality if you leave out some aspects that are either helping or hindering our faith? So this is an interesting question to look at. But your specific question is what caused them to dissolve? Partly because Hyde Dunn and Clara Dunn could not stay in every town. They were the glue that held these communities together. They could only stay a matter of months before they had to move on. Once they moved on, those new Baha'is were on their own. And they all had different ideas about what was the right thing to do. And so that's just part of the growing process.
Did some of those Baha'is left the faith at that time?
Yes, sure. Now, so look, we've got to have a method here for asking questions. One way is that you've got a little button that comes up and it shows a little blue hand. Can we see that? There's a little blue button somewhere. Who knows where it is?
Reactions.
Right.
Like this, like that.
Okay, so if you put one of those up, I can see, and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Friends, we have a half hour for discussion. So Neil Podger, I think you wanted to say.
Graham, in Gleanings, Baha'u'llah says the dark clouds that veil the population are the changes that the messenger of God brings are so challenging that it it just flattens them. And this, for example, Jesus Christ with the abandonment of the Sabbath day and divorce, and then Baha'u'llah says, and then now we come to this faith, as challenging as it is, these are as dark clouds that veil the population from the acceptance.
Yes.
That's it.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that comment, Neil. Thank you.
Graham?
You have to.
Oh, I can't. I can't get my hand to work. But I've only got claps. See, I can't find a hand. It's driving me nuts.
So you go to the participants and then you will see the raise hand. Go to the participants and you see the raise hand.
Brian.
Alan, go ahead, please.
Okay. There was a collection of photos that we prepared for the I think it was the 20th anniversary of the dedication of the Baha'i temple, and it was put on a display at the temple for quite some time. It's one of those rotary slide collections with a synchronized tape. You might find some interesting resources in that to go with the history of the building of the Baha'i temple.
Did it have the raised hand?
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
The other question I had was how do we show the impact of the Baha'i community on the wider society? I think that's the question. I mean, you've shown us the growth of the Australian Baha'i community and its development, but how do we show its impact on the Australian community as a whole?
I think that's a question for all to contemplate and to offer their thoughts. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment?
Graham, it's Ovid here.
Hello, Arvid.
Graham, you talked about the slide where you described the growth of the faith, and I've been at conventions in the last 30 years where some people suggest it could have been better. I know that you've lived in quite a few continents, as have I, with comparable countries, middle powers, Western democracy economies. How would we compare with comparable countries with the growth of the faith? Just your personal observations.
But that question is too hard for me.
Nothing's too hard for you, Graham. We haven't lagged behind, though, have we?
Arvid, there are so many people in this session who have more profound insights into that question than me.
Okay.
Look, so I'll go to some new hands up. Sorry. So I'm going to go to Natalie. Natalie, you seem to be mute for some reason. Check your microphone, please. Speak. I think it's okay. Speak.
Is that better now?
Yes, please speak.
Oh, okay. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Graham. Something that seems quite striking when one looks at the very early period is that it seems that many more women than men were attracted into the community in the early days. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around the reasons for that.
Listen, I'm not enjoying these questions at all. Look, numerically, there were more women taking leading roles than men at national level. now, it could be that in some cases, these women were not working and the men were their partners who were working full time. That's one aspect of it, but it's not the whole story, because some of these women were single and they were able to put all of their resource into their Baha'i service. I think we need to do more investigation as to what this phenomenon means and whether it has continued. That's not much of an answer for you, Natalie. I just think it's something we need to look at. But the women who joined the community in their 30s and 40s, they were very strong personalities. When you think of people like Bertha Dobbins, people like Mariette Bolton, Breda Lake, goodness knows, Hilda Brooks, and some of the others, Jane Ralph, were strong personalities. So they played dominant roles because it was just their natural way. They were not shy people. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Behruz, please.
Thank you, Graham, for such a beautiful presentation. I just wanted to make a comment. It appears that sometimes we see that progress that we are making is not to the expectation. But I think we need to really look at some of the reality in life, and that is there are lots of outside factors, materialism, all the difficulties that exist in life outside the Baha'i community has been really contributing a lot to this. I think we need to really look at how far we have come rather than how far we have to go, because the road to the future is very thorny and very difficult, but we have come made a lot of progress coming to this stage. We are standing on the shoulders of giants that brought the cause to this stage. To me, as a Persian, I'm really so confirmed that how the Australian Bahai community has done so much their share, bringing the faith to the Pacific Islands and illuminating the Pacific Island. I think that's a great achievement, and we should be very proud of the Australian Bahai community. I think when you look at the writing that Graham shared with us tonight from the beloved Guardian, that 6 members of the National Assembly left to pioneering in 1953, it's unheard of any of the National Assembly in the world to be like this. So I think we have to be very looking at positive side of what we have achieved and then build on that and go forward. And I really thank you, Graham, for sharing all these wonderful stories with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Behruz. Thank you. Thank you. Sahela, June.
Thank you. I'd like to echo and build on what other friends have said about your presentation. Very thorough, very illuminating. Thank you so much. I know that there's a lot of work you have put into this, and you've summarized it in so many beautiful, meaningful way. I have 2 questions. One is like, I got really happy seeing that photo with yourself as a child and another child. So in terms of from a historical perspective, what has been the role of children, or like how children had been perceived, and like what role do they play in the development of the community? That's one. And the other one is that what is the best way to share your presentation with our friends? Because, you know, it's a very broad spectrum. There are some that might, you know, appeals more than other points. So please share some thoughts on those 2 points.
Thank you, Sahela. I've set up a YouTube site, and so we will put these recordings on that site, so they'll be available to anybody who hears of this series afterwards. It's a grassroots initiative. It's just going to go by word of mouth. And it's really, it's not polished presentations. It's it's trying to draw out what we need to do to develop our history and our biography, right? So it really is only for people who really want to ask the sort of questions you're asking. It doesn't need to be every Baha'i comes and looks at this. We're not after 700 people to look at these or be part of these presentations. We just want people who want to engage with these questions. Now, your question about children, you know, the interesting thing is growing up as a Baha'i child, and I see that Chris Heggy's online here. Chris was one of my playmates. And the adults took us seriously and made us feel welcome at meetings. Even though we were young and our main concern was to play outside, we have memories of these, what I regard as very old ladies who would come up, for example, when we read in the house of worship, they'd come up and say, "You read very nicely, thank you very much." And so the children were not overlooked, even though there was only a few of us. And I think it's a key point that as the communities get bigger, that we make sure that the children aren't overlooked in any way, just because they're the children and they're out the back and someone's looking after them or something like that. So the children play a very important role in making that connection with the next generation. Now, in our case, there were very few. Back in the 60s, there was only 3 or 4 or 5. I don't know if my friend Tim Sales online right now, but there were just a few of us. And we valued each other, but the adults valued us.
Yeah, I grew up in Australia as a Baha'i child, and I remember being told stories about how my family found out about the faith. And I think it would be really interesting to have more people that grew up in that time I think it was when I was about 4 years old, so 1970s, and some of those stories. I think I realized talking to my mum and dad or other people that we could collect those stories. And so I remember being at that Peace Expo as well. And so it's like that thing, as we go through, we realize that some of these stories are very important. The thing that I'll be talking about later, and I don't want to go too much into that, is I also think there's an opportunity to connect with people through history, to the families that are descendants of many of these early Baha'is. What is their present connection to the faith? And if they don't have one, are they perhaps interested to find out those stories and to reconnect to what is really their spiritual heritage? So I think that we can relate many things that we think are not directly related to the current plan actually can become very connected to it, because there's a great power in story and the stories of history. And, you know, anyway, there's just some really exciting things in the way that children and the grandchildren of some of these people, I think you're going to find out, do connect into this. So in answer to Sahela's question, there are stories in South Australia of children who went to children's classes with beautiful Baha'is that pioneered and then later became believers. So that is one way. There is a history of children connecting and being attracted to people who are travel teachers or who have such a belief in the oneness of humanity in the very early history when Australia was still in the throes of the white Australia policy, and Baha'is, I think, at a transformative level were very spiritual and outgoing, and many of them were making friendships across all backgrounds. So yeah.
Thank you, June. Now, friends, I have a number of hands up, so we'll get through. And I may not come back to you if you've already asked something, because there's a number of hands up. And Andrew Stranieri, please.
Thanks, Graham. That was terrific. I'm curious about the religious background of the early believers. Did they come mostly from Catholic backgrounds, Protestant or agnostic backgrounds, and how were they received as Baha'is? Were they by the wider Australian community, or the communities, the religious communities they came from?
Okay, that's an important question, and I don't have all the details on that. I think that there's more Protestant than Catholic. Catholic had a larger hold over members, that even if they left the Catholic Church, they didn't leave being Catholic. And so it was a rarer occasion for a Catholic to become a Baha'i adherent. They had a stronger fear of hell. but we need to do more work on this. And another interesting thing, because we're trying to do a little bit of theoretical work here as well, right? A wonderful Canadian Bahai named Will Vandenhoenaard has talked about biographical zoning. And what he refers to is where Baha'is only talk to each other about their Baha'i life and they don't talk about the rest of their life. For example, their social background or religious background. So it means that a lot of the early Baha'is, we don't know what their affiliations were. Because they only talked about, they were so excited about being Baha'is, they didn't spend time talking about what they had left behind. But what we do know is that there are a number of cases in which families who adopted the Baha'i faith in Australia were ostracized by their families for that, and took many years to repair those links. And it was quite a challenge to have the courage of your convictions and join the Baha'i community in the early days in Australia. And I don't think it'd be the same these days. But these are matters for if anybody wants to look sociologically at that and see if there has been a difference, because I've said that I think there's been a drop in sectarianism. And if that is true, that means that most families would say, okay, you've changed your faith, that's okay. Another point I want to make in relation, going back to the question of children in the second generation, there's a wonderful sociologist of religion named Wolfgang Wach, W-A-C-H. And he talked about the second generation. And he points out that somebody who changes religion has done it out of the conviction of their heart, but their children didn't make that same choice. So that the children of the first Baha'i converts didn't make that choice. And they had to make decisions later. Wach's point in this, he says that for a sect to become a denomination, and he's talking within Christian tradition, there were many Christian sects, but if the children didn't accept it, it didn't survive. So it's been crucial for the promotion, the evolution of the Australian Baha'i community, that the children of Baha'i parents also become Baha'is. But there are many children who have decided not to. And it's just as valid as to what it was that they didn't find that it was attractive enough to become a member of this community. Some of them, for example, say, well, I never saw my parents. They were just all the time at meetings. I didn't have parents. They were just busy with their religion. And this brings up interesting questions about balance and how you achieve everything. These are very real issues that families face, how to balance service to the faith with service to the community. And, I mentioned that just as one of those realities of the different generations of the Australian Baha'i community. Something for us to, be very sympathetic to the children of very active Baha'is. They didn't have normal parents who went out and spent the whole weekend at the football game. So, and we have to recognize that it was very different to other parents in Australian society. I just mentioned that as a sociological dimension to it. Look, I'm pleased to invite Janet Khan to make a comment or question.
Thank you, Graham. I wanted to pick up on the question that I think Natalie raised about the participation of women in the early development of the faith. And I'm reminded that Abdu'l-Baha made a comment about the participation of women in the West. And he commented on the significance of their involvement and the extent of their participation. And Shoghi Effendi picked up on that as well and expressed the hope that this would continue. I think beyond that, though, I'd be interested in knowing whether women in other religions at the time, what was their level of participation? Another sociological question, because I think it's useful to search for other reasons for why things might happen. So, within Australia at the time, was the participation of women much more than the participation of men?
Thank you, Janet. There are studies of women in Christian organizations, and in the 20s and 30s, they were manning even manning's the wrong word, but they were running the cake stalls. They had no role in the leadership of their church communities, and it was a very stark contrast to their roles when they joined the Baha'i community. So this is written about by a number of scholars of religion in Australia. Michael Hogan, The Sectarian Strand, the work of Moll, Religion in Australia, and others, many, many. And it's changed now, but thank you for that. So yeah, it's something we need to look at more. Anne Stark, please.
Thanks, Graham. I'm going to echo everybody else's comment that say thank you for such a great presentation. It's not easy to bring the amount of data and material that you've presented tonight down to a 1-hour presentation. So there was real craft and skill in that. Thank you very much. I also wanted to echo your experience as a Baha'i child. I think that indeed being attended to and being treated as a member of the community right from being a tiny person is a very vital aspect of a membership, being a member of a community. My question relates in fact to community. I was really moved by the stories of the individuals that you gave early on. They were wonderful stories and they touched the heart, and just like the stories of Effie last week. And then you said, once a community gets into thousands, I think I'm quoting you correctly, you don't tell the story of individuals, you have to talk about a community. How can we tell the story of communities in a way that touches the heart, the way that stories of individuals seem to touch the heart?
Yeah, exactly. We need to find a method of digesting the experience of the community that doesn't lose track of the individual. Now, the reason I made that comment is we can't say, here's the experience of the Australian Bahai community, I'm going to tell you about 15,000 people. That's not going to work. So we need to extract their experience and maybe highlight the experience of some members. There's always going to be room for biography, autobiography, but we won't be able to tell 15,000 stories. So how do we bring out the story and on what basis would you privilege the story of one person as compared to others? That's a difficult question of method that I don't want to bring up now. But the other part of the question that you asked is, well, how do you make the story interesting? If you're talking about the decisions of local assemblies as to what they do in their community and how they run it, it's very impersonal in a way. It's very, you know, we don't, it's got to still be speaking about people. So I think that this is where we just need to keep this conversation going, where we don't lose sight either of the coherence of the community as a whole and the role of institutions. In other words, you don't have to just be a stories of people, because that's good field stories, but it doesn't explain to us how the community is moving forward or how it's relating to its institutions and how they're working together to solve difficult problems. So we'll need to have this balance between individual stories. And now one other part of this question is, you see, if you tell the story of a pioneer who's traveled and done different things, it might be an exciting story, but there are stories of devoted Baha'is who didn't travel anywhere. They stayed in one town, they raised their families, they're devoted Baha'is, they served their communities, and it doesn't have the same excitement to it, but it's got the same devotion to it, you see? So there's this balancing of these different aspects to relating the story of our faith. I think that it's just a really good question to ask. So thank you for that, Anne. Thank you. I've got 3 hands at the moment: Farin, Siva, and June, and then maybe some other new hands. And Olia after that. But Farin, then Siva, then June. Farin, please.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you again, similar to others. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question was whether yourself or somebody else has done a correlation between the growth of the Baha'i community and the activities or the events, major events in Australian society. You know, for example, what would be the impact of the growth or the Aboriginal emancipation in terms of voting? What are the significant events in the Australian society that has had any impact on the growth of the Baha'i faith. Is there any correlation that you've seen of any sort? Thank you.
I think the numbers are still too small. The First World War had an impact in which there were people specifically looking for a peace religion. They wanted an end to war, and they found the Baha'i faith with the idea of global collective security, and they joined. People like Bertha Dobbins and Joe Dobbins were in that category. When you talk about the changed conditions of the Aboriginal community, I don't yet know. We'll need to talk to others about whether that in itself had an impact on Aboriginals becoming Baha'is. I don't think so, but we'd defer to the scholarship of others on that point. The biggest impact on the Australian Baha'i community was the Iranian Revolution. Siva, please, lovely to see you.
Thank you. It seems that you are the pioneer of this work and also probably the only one who is doing this. So my question is, one, you mentioned in the talk that the factual one, it's much easier to do, but there are something that on the analysis, they have to do a lot of work. To continue this work that you have been doing, what advice and encouragement you can give to younger generation, because so that it should continue, and because now there are a lot of Baha'is now and a lot of activities, so the history has to be captured and to be inspiring. So what advice can you give?
Thank you, Siva. And as I say, it's lovely to see you online. I'm not the only one doing this. There's many people who are doing this type of work, and this series shows that as well. But the way I started was to ask the question, who were the first Baha'is around me? If you're a part of a Baha'i family, talk to the family and say, when did you become a Baha'i and how, and how did it go? If you're in a community and you ask the question, who were the first Baha'is in our community? Do we have the records? Are their relatives still alive? Could we go and meet them? I still live in hope of finding relatives of Hyde Dunn, who it might have been to them a great uncle or great uncle in the line, and they may have something. So the first place to ask is where you're living. Who are the first Baha'is here? Did they write their story down? And we have these technologies now to easily sit down and say, tell me about how you first heard of the Baha'i faith, tell us their story, and then you can from there. I can provide a list of 10 questions that can to get started. And the reason I'm doing this series is because I think the more people that do this in their local communities, the more we can write our little community histories and share them with new Baha'is when they join in that area. We say, look, you know, the Baha'i faith's been in our town for 50 years already. Rather than saying, oh, I only just heard of it last year, how come I didn't know? We say, well, here's a little booklet that explains who the first Baha'is were. The other value, of course, is that the Persian friends who have arrived since the 1980s and who are now half the community, but they do not know this history unless it's written down and some of it translated for them, that they will know that all of the legal recognition that they have, their rights as Baha'is in Australia, the establishment of the fact we've got a house of worship, the fact that we've got this wonderful NSA and all the structure was the efforts of these early Baha'is who were Australians. And so there's many functions that we have in doing this history. Now, the other thing, of course, is to, you know, for the scholars of religion in Australia, they say, well, I want to refer to Baha'i, but there's nothing to refer to. So we need some scholarly work so they can refer to it in their work, and then we will be picked up more in the discourse on values in Australia. Olya, please.
Mr. Hassall, I would like to appreciate from bottom of my heart. Really, I learned a lot. During to this meeting, I am you're talking about Australian history, make my life change. So happy. I learned a lot and remind me that when we moved from England 2019, Mr. Stephen Hall and also Professor Cyrus Naraki came to visit us. And they both mentioned we have a lot of Australian Bahai in Australia, but if you go to Feast, you can see majority Iranian Baha'is. Don't be surprised. Only tell to Baha'i, Iranian Baha'i would be nice. You stand up behind the Australian Baha'i, not come front of them and make Dr. Cyrus Naraki was lovely talk. Said, unfortunately, Iranian Baha'i came here. They mentioned to, for example, Australian is Khariji, like foreigner. This is the mention. Said we have to be behind them. They put them to front of us. But believe me, I want to say thank you to Corona to coming to see the Baha'i, Australian Baha'i come and get this talk, experience, history, tell us history of Baha'i, Australian Baha'i. That was so wonderful, touched my heart. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, we're going to finish soon. We've got just a few more hands up. Mariette and then Thelma, and then I'll see if there's any last comment. And Citare.
Okay. Yes, wonderful presentation, Graham. I just wanted to just make a quick comment, following on also from what Janet Khan had said about women. You know, those women that pioneered in 1954, well, actually, the pioneers of the 10-year crusade, most of them were women that went out into the Pacific. And I seem to have a figure in my head that 11 out of 17 were women. I don't know whether that figure resonates with you, Graham, but somewhere I've read out of the 17 pioneers that went out during the 10-year crusade, 11 of them were women. So I think it's part of the equality of men and women, and as you know, Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi also mentioned that it's the day of the women, really.
That's right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thelma?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the UK, we have been collecting histories for several years now. There is a website, UK Bahai Histories, and the wonderful thing is that there are so many stories available. We were lucky about 20, 25 years ago, this project began. And so we've got the stories, they were written down then. Obviously no internet or anything, but we have the stories of some of those people that became Baha'is around the 1940s, 1950s, but more recently, and now we've got hundreds of people writing. It's quite a struggle to get the stories. You know, you have to be very persistent, say please, and then remind them in another 6 months and another 6 months. But it does happen, and we've got some wonderful stories. And I think that, well, a lot of people say, well, we've got nothing interesting to say. My story is very ordinary. But of course, we're all making history. And I think of the future archivists and historians, they're going to look back to their own little village, their own little town. Was there anybody here that was a Baha'i in the 1980s, 1990s, 2020? And, you know, that some of these, it's going to be very interesting for these historians to find that, yes, there was a Baha'i. And we encourage them when they're writing their stories to mention other Baha'is who've had some, you know, impact on their lives. And so, you know, overall, this is for future research, but there's been a lot written in this country about Baha'i histories.
Yes, thank you, Thelma. That's a wonderful site, UK Baha'i Histories. I get the updates and it's just very inspiring. So thanks for advertising that here. Citare? Unmute. You're an expert now.
Thanks for an amazing, wonderful presentation, Graham. I just have one question. In the Australian Bahai community, as far as you are aware, are there any well-established local archives within the Bahai community? And So that's just the first question. And also, I know that we're going to later have a session on archives, and also what education is taking place for the establishment of local archives, if there isn't, any education, because I'm aware that there's quite a number of believers in the community, especially older believers, that have amazing archival resources. And where does it go? And someone will say, for example, like, oh, look, I've got this and this and this, but I don't think we really have an archive. So just hang on to this in case I die, because you'll file it somewhere. But I'm just wondering what kind of progress has been made at the local level, if you're aware of that.
Oh, great question. And I'm just checking to see if Satu's online. I can't see. Eric, is Satu around? She didn't get online.
Can I say something about this?
Yes, go ahead, Ahmed. Ahmed is associated with the archives. Before you do, Ahmed, who's the current archivist, she was going to join us tonight. I'm very concerned at the quality of archives preservation in Australia at a regional level, whether it's local level or regional, but I know there's a lot of wonderful resources that slip through the cracks because fully address this, and that's why I really insisted, to Satu, please come and talk about archives this year in this process so that we answer your question. But I just preface that Ahmed's been involved in this work and he's probably got part of the answer as well.
Well, I'm a member of the committee, and Fazlullah, I don't know whether he's with Olia or not, he's on the committee as well. There are a number of local assemblies that keep their archives, and they are meticulously done. But basically, when a person pass away, we do get some of their leftover things, and especially if they're important people of the past, and they're archived in the basement of the temple. Now, obviously, education is important. We have made a publication for the local spiritual assemblies. And I know that our community, for example, in Korengai, has got a small archives, and we keep a small archive of the documents of the past. So there is resources, but I mean, because of limitations, it's not perfect.
Thank you for that. Friends, we've reached 9 o'clock and 9:30. I think it's later than we were going to go. So we'll bring this to an end. I'll stop the recording now.